Life is complex. Join us for the simple gifts of wisdom, love, and delight in the written word. Of Plymouth Plantation, William Bradford. Chapter 9. The Mayflower sails from Plymouth. Voyage. Arrival at Cape Cod. September to November 1620. These troubles being over, and all being together in the one ship, they put to sea again on September 6th, with a prosperous wind, which continued for several days and was some encouragement to them, though, as usual, many were afflicted with seasickness. I must not omit to mention here a special example of God's providence. There was an insolent and very profane young man, one of the sailors, which made him the more overbearing, who was always harassing the poor people in their sickness, and cursing them daily with grievous execrations, and did not hesitate to tell them he hoped to help throw half of them overboard before they came to their journey's end. If he were gently reproved by anyone, he would curse and swear most bitterly. But it pleased God, before they came half seas over, to smite the young man with a grievous disease, of which he died in a desperate manner, and so was himself the first to be thrown overboard. Thus his curses fell upon his own head, which astonished all his mates, for they saw it was the just hand of God upon him. After they had enjoyed fair winds and weather for some time, they encountered cross winds and many fierce storms, by which the ship was much shaken, and her upper works made very leaky. One of the main beams amidships was bent and cracked, which made them afraid that she might not be able to complete the voyage. So some of the chiefs of the voyagers, seeing that the sailors doubted the efficiency of the ship, entered into serious consultation with the captain and officers to weigh the danger betimes, and rather to return than to cast themselves into desperate and inevitable peril. Indeed, there was great difference of opinion amongst the crew themselves. They wished to do whatever could be done for the sake of their wages, being now halfway over. On the other hand, they were loath to risk their lives too desperately. But at length all opinions, the captain's and others included, agreed that the ship was sound under the water line. And as for the buckling of the main beam, there was a great iron screw the passengers brought out of Holland, by which the beam could be raised into its place. And the carpenter affirmed that with a post put under it, set firm in the lower deck, and otherwise fastened, he could make it hold. As for the decks and upper works, they said they would caulk them as well as they could, and though with the working of the ship they would not long keep staunch, yet there would otherwise be no great danger if they did not overpress her with sail. So they committed themselves to the will of God, and resolved to proceed. In several of these storms the wind was so strong and the seas so high that they could not carry a knot of sail, but were forced to Hull for many days. Once as they thus lay at Hull in a terrible storm, a strong young man, called John Howland, coming on deck, was thrown into the sea. But it pleased God that he caught hold on the topsail halyards, which hung overboard and ran out at length. But he kept his hold, though he was several fathoms under water, till he was hauled up by the rope, and then with a boat hook helped into the ship and saved. And though he was somewhat ill from it, he lived many years, and became a profitable member both of the church and commonwealth. In all the voyage only one of the passengers died, and that was William Button, a youth, servant to Samuel Fuller, when they were nearing the coast. But to be brief, after long beating at sea, on November 11th they fell in with a part of the land called Cape Cod, at which they were not a little joyful. After some deliberation among themselves, and with the captain, they tacked about and resolved to stand for the southward, the wind and weather being fair, to find some place near Hudson's River for their habitation. But after they had kept that course about half a day, they met with dangerous shoals and roaring breakers, and as they conceived themselves in great danger, the wind falling, they resolved to bear up again for the Cape, and thought themselves happy to get out of danger before night overtook them, as by God's providence they did. Next day they got into the bay, where they rode in safety. A word or two by the way of this cape. It was first thus named by Captain Gosnold and his people in 1602, because they caught much of that fish there, and afterwards was called Cape James by Captain Smith. But it retains the former name among seamen. The point where they first met with those dangerous shoals they called Point Care, or Tucker's Terror. but the French and Dutch to this day call it Malabar. Having found a good haven and being brought safely in sight of land, they fell upon their knees and blessed the God of heaven, who had brought them over the vast and furious ocean, and delivered them from all the perils and miseries of it, again to set their feet upon the firm and stable earth, their proper element. And no marvel that they were thus joyful, when the wise Seneca was so affected with sailing a few miles on the coast of his own Italy, that he affirmed he had rather taken 20 years to make his way by land, than to go by sea to any place in however short a time, so tedious and dreadful it was to him. But here I cannot but make a pause, and stand half amazed at this poor people's present condition, and so I think will the reader too, when he considers it well. Having thus passed the vast ocean, and that sea of troubles before while they were making their preparations, they now had no friends to welcome them, nor inns to entertain and refresh their weather-beaten bodies, nor houses, much less towns, to repair to. It is recorded in Scripture, Acts 28, as a mercy to the apostle and his shipwrecked crew, that the barbarians showed them no small kindness in refreshing them. But these savage barbarians, when they met with them, as will appear, were readier to fill their sides full of arrows than otherwise. As for the season, it was winter, and those who have experienced the winters of the country know them to be sharp and severe, and subject to fierce storms, when it is dangerous to travel to known places, much more to search an unknown coast. Besides, what could they see but a desolate wilderness, full of wild beasts and wild men? And what multitude there might be of them they knew not. Neither could they, as it were, go up to the top of Pisgah, to view from this wilderness a more goodly country to feed their hopes. For which way soever they turned their eyes, save upward to the heavens, they could gain little solace from any outward objects. Summer being done, all things turned upon them a weather-beaten face, and the whole country, full of woods and thickets, presented a wild and savage view. If they looked behind them, there was the mighty ocean, which they had passed, and was now a gulf separating them from all civilized parts of the world. If it be said that they had their ship to turn to, it is true. But what did they hear daily from the captain and crew? That they should quickly look out for a place with their shallop, where they would not be far off, for the season was such that the captain would not approach nearer to the shore till a harbor had been discovered which he could enter safely, and that the food was being consumed apace, but he must and would keep sufficient for the return voyage. It was even muttered by some of the crew that if they did not find a place in time, they would turn them and their goods ashore and leave them. Let it be remembered, too, what small hope of further assistance from England they had left behind them, to support their courage in this sad condition, and the trials they were under. For how the case stood between the settlers and the merchants at their departure has already been described. It is true, indeed, that the affection and love of their brethren at Leyden towards them was cordial and unbroken, but they had little power to help them or themselves. What, then, could now sustain them but the Spirit of God, and his grace? Ought not the children of their fathers rightly to say, "Our fathers were Englishmen who came over the great ocean, and were ready to perish in this wilderness. But they cried unto the Lord, and he heard their voice, and looked on their adversity. Let them therefore praise the Lord, because he is good, and his mercies endure forever. Yea, let them that have been redeemed of the Lord show how he hath delivered them from the hand of the oppressor. When they wandered forth into the desert wilderness out of the way, and found no city to dwell in, both hungry and thirsty, their soul was overwhelmed in them. Let them confess before the Lord his loving kindness, and his wonderful works before the sons of men."
'Tis the gift to be simple. 'Tis the gift to be free. 'Tis the gift to come down where we ought to be. And when we find ourselves in the place just right, 'twill be in the valley of love and delight. When true simplicity is gained, to bow and to bend, we will not be ashamed. To turn will be our delight, till by turning, we come round right.
Life is complex. Join us for the simple gifts of wisdom, love, and delight in the written word.
Of Plymouth Plantation, William Bradford. Chapter 10. The Pilgrims seek a site for their settlement, and discover the harbor of New Plymouth, November through December, 1620. They thus arrived at Cape Cod on the 11th of November, and necessity called on them to look out for a place of habitation. Having brought a large shallop with them from England, stowed in quarters in the ship, they now got her out, and set their carpenters to work to trim her up. But being much bruised and battered in the foul weather, they saw she would be long mending. So a few of them volunteered to go by land and explore the neighboring parts, whilst the shallop was put in order, particularly since, as they entered the bay, there seemed to be an opening some 2 or 3 leagues off, which the captain thought was a river. It was conceived there might be some danger in the attempt, but seeing them resolute, 16 of them, well armed, were permitted to go, under charge of Captain Standish. They set forth on the 15th of November, being landed by the ship's boat. And when they had marched about the space of a mile by the seaside, they espied 5 or 6 persons with a dog coming towards them. They were savages, but they fled back into the woods, followed by the English, who wished to see if they could speak with them, and to discover if there were more lying in ambush. But the Indians, seeing themselves followed, left the woods, and ran along the sands as hard as they could, so our men could not come up with them, but followed the track of their feet several miles. Night coming on, they made their rendezvous, and set sentinels, and rested in quiet. Next morning they again pursued the Indians' tracks till they came to a great creek, where they had left the sands and turned into the woods. But they continued to follow them by guess, hoping to find their dwellings. But soon they lost both the Indians and themselves, and fell into such thickets that their clothes and armor were injured severely. But they suffered most from want of water. At length they found some, and refreshed themselves with the first New England water they had drunk, and in their great thirst they found it as pleasant as wine or beer had been before. Afterwards they directed their course towards the other shore, for they knew it was only a neck of land they had to cross over. At length they got to the seaside, and marched to this supposed river, and by the way found a pond of fresh water, and shortly after a quantity of cleared ground where the Indians had formerly planted corn, and they found some of their graves. Proceeding further, they saw stubble where corn had been grown the same year, and also found a place where a house had lately been, with some planks, and a great kettle and heaps of sand newly banked, under which they found several large baskets filled with corn, some in the ear of various colors, which was a very goodly sight, they having never seen any like it before. This was near the supposed river that they had come to seek. When they reached it, they found that it opened into 2 arms, with a high cliff of sand at the entrance, but more likely to be creeks of salt water than fresh, they thought. There was good harborage for their shallop, so they left it to be further explored when she was ready. The time allowed them having expired, they returned to the ship, lest the others should be anxious about their safety. They took part of the corn and buried the rest, and so, like the men from Escole, carried with them the fruits of the land, and showed their brethren, at which the rest were very glad and greatly encouraged. After this, the shallop being ready, they set out again for the better reconnoitering of the place. The captain of the ship desired to go himself, so there were some 30 men. However, they found it to be no harbor for ships, but only for boats. They also found 2 of the Indians' houses covered with mats, and some of their implements in them, but the people had run away and could not be seen. They also found more corn, and beans of various colors. These they brought away, intending to give them full satisfaction when they should meet with any of them, as about 6 months afterwards they did. And it is to be noted as a special providence of God, and a great mercy to this poor people, that they thus got seed to plant corn the next year, or they might have starved, for they had none, nor any likelihood of getting any, till too late for the planting season. Nor is it likely that they would have got it if this first voyage had not been made, for the ground was soon all covered with snow and frozen hard. But the Lord is never wanting unto his in their great need. Let his holy name have all the praise. The month of November being spent in these affairs, and foul weather coming on the 6th of December they sent out their shallop again, with 10 of their principal men, and some sailors upon further discovery, intending to circumnavigate the deep bay of Cape Cod. The weather was very cold, and it froze so hard that the spray of the sea froze on their coats like glass. Early that night they got to the lower end of the bay, and as they drew near the shore they saw 10 or 12 Indians very busy about something. They landed about a league or 2 from them, though they had much ado to put ashore anyway, it was so full of flats. It was late when they landed, So they made themselves a barricade of logs and boughs as well as they could in the time, and set a sentinel, and betook them to rest, and saw the smoke of the fire the savages made that night. When morning came, they divided their party, some to coast along the shore in the boat, and the rest to march through the woods to see the land, and, if possible, to find a fit place for their settlement. They came to the place where they had seen the Indians the night before, and found they had been cutting up a great fish like a grampus, covered with almost 2 inches of fat, like a hog. The shallop found 2 more of the same kind of fish dead on the sands, a usual thing after storms there, because of the great flats of sand. They ranged up and down all that day, but found no people nor any place they liked. When the sun got low, they hastened out of the woods to meet their shallop, making signs to it to come into a creek hard by, which it did at high water. They were very glad to meet, for they had not seen each other since the morning. They made a barricade, as they did every night, with logs, stakes, and thick pine boughs, the height of a man, leaving it open to the leeward, partly to shelter them from the cold wind, making their fire in the middle and lying around it, and partly to defend them from any sudden assaults of the savages if they should try to surround them. So being very weary, they betook them to rest. But about midnight they heard a hideous cry, and their sentinel called, "Arm! Arm!" So they bestirred themselves, and stood to their arms, and shot a couple of muskets, and then the noise ceased. They concluded it was a pack of wolves, or some such wild beasts, for one of the sailors told them he had often heard such noises in Newfoundland. So they rested till about 5 o'clock in the morning. After prayer they prepared for breakfast, and it being day dawning, it was thought best to be carrying things down to the boat. Some said it was not best to carry the guns down. Others said they would be the readier, for they had wrapped them up in their coats to keep them from the dew. But some 3 or 4 would not carry their guns down to the boat till they went themselves. However, as the water was not high enough, the others laid theirs down on the bank of the creek and came up to breakfast. But soon, all of a sudden, they heard a great and strange cry, which they knew to be the same as they had heard in the night, though with various notes. One of the company who was outside came running in and cried, "Men! Indians! Indians!" And at that their arrows came flying amongst them. The men ran down to the creek with all speed to recover their guns, which by the providence of God they succeeded in doing. In the meantime, 2 of those who were still armed discharged their muskets at the Indians, and 2 more stood ready at the entrance of the rendezvous, but were commanded not to shoot till they could take fell aim at them, and the other 2 loaded again at full speed, there being only 4 guns there to defend the barricade when it was first assaulted. The cry of the Indians was dreadful, especially when they saw the men run out of the rendezvous towards the shallop to recover their guns, the Indians wheeling about them. But some of the men, armed with coats of mail and with cutlasses in their hands, soon got their guns and let fly among them, which quickly stopped their violence. There was one big Indian, and no less valiant, who stood behind a tree, within half a musket shot, and let his arrows fly at them. He was seen to shoot 3 arrows, which were all avoided. He stood 3 musket shots, till one of them made the bark and splinters of the tree fly about his ears, at which he gave an extraordinary shriek, and away all of them went. The men left some of the party to guard the shallop, and followed the Indians about 1/4 of a mile, shouting once or twice, and shooting off 2 or 3 guns, and then returned. They did this so that the natives might not think that they were afraid of them. Thus it pleased God to vanquish their enemies, and give them deliverance, and by his special providence so to dispose that not one of them was hit, though the arrows came close to them on every side, and some of their coats which were hung up in the barricade were shot through and through. Afterwards they gave God solemn thanks and praise for their deliverance, and gathered up a bundle of the arrows, and later sent them to England by the captain of the ship. They called the place the First Encounter. Then they left, and coasted all along, but discovered no likely place for a harbor. So they made all speed to a spot which their pilot, a Mr. Coppin, who had been in the country before, assured them was a good harbor, which he had been in, and which they might fetch before night. Of this they were glad, for the weather began to be foul. After some hours' sailing it began to snow and rain, and about the middle of the afternoon the wind increased, and the sea became very rough. They broke their rudder, and it was as much as 2 of them could do to steer her with a couple of oars. But the pilot bade them be of good cheer, and said he saw the harbor. But the storm increasing, and night drawing on, they carried all the sail they could to get in while they could see. Then their mast broke in 3 pieces, and the sail fell overboard in a very heavy sea, so that they were in danger of being wrecked. But by God's mercy they recovered themselves, and having the tide with them, struck in towards the harbor. But when they came to, the pilot found he had mistaken the place, and said the Lord be merciful to them, for he had never seen the place before. And he and the mate were about to run her ashore in a cove full of breakers before the wind. But one of the seamen, who steered, bade the rowers, if they were men, about with her, or they would all be cast away, which they did with speed. So he bid them be of good cheer, and row lustily, for there was a fair sound before them. And he did not doubt but they would find a place where they could come to safety. Though it was very dark and rained hard, they ultimately got under the lee of a small island, and remained there safely all night. But they did not know it was an island till morning. They were divided in their mind. Some wished to stay in the boat, for fear there would be more Indians. Others were so weak and cold they could not endure it, but got ashore and with much ado made a fire, everything being wet. And then the rest were glad enough to join them, for after midnight the wind shifted to the northwest, and it froze hard. But though this had been a night of much hardship and danger, God gave them a morning of comfort and refreshment, as he usually doth to his children. For the next day was a fair sun-shining day, and they found they were on an island secure from the Indians, where they could dry their stuff, fix their arms, and rest themselves, and give God thanks for his mercies in their manifold deliverances. This being the last day of the week, they prepared to keep the Sabbath there. On Monday they sounded the harbor, and found it fit for shipping. And marching inland they found several cornfields and little running brooks, a place, as they supposed, fit for a settlement. At least it was the best they could find, and considering the season of the year and their present necessity, they were thankful for it. So they returned with this news to the rest of their people aboard the ship, which cheered them greatly. On the 15th day of December they weighed anchor to go to the place they had discovered, and came within 2 leagues of it, but had to bear up again. On the 16th day the wind came fair, and they arrived safe in the harbor. Afterwards they took a better view of the place, and resolved where to pitch their dwellings. And on the 25th day they began to erect the first house for common use, to receive them and their goods.
'Tis the gift to be simple. 'Tis the gift to be free. 'Tis the gift to come down where we ought to be. And when we find ourselves in the place just right, 'twill be in the valley of love and delight. When true simplicity is gained, to bow and to bend, we will not be ashamed. To turn will be our delight, till by turning, we come round right.
Life is complex. Join us for the simple gifts of wisdom, love, and delight in the written word.
Of Plymouth Plantation by William Bradford. Book 2, 1620 to 1646. History of the new settlement at Plymouth. 1. Deed of government drawn up. Death of half their number. Squanto. Compact with the Indians. Captain Dermer's description of New Plymouth, 1620. The rest of this work, if God give me life and opportunity, I shall, for brevity's sake, handle in the form of annals, noting only the principal doings, chronologically. First, I will turn back a little and begin with a compact or deed drawn up by them before they went ashore to settle, constituting the first foundation of their government. This was occasioned partly by the discontented and mutinous speeches that some of the strangers amongst them had let fall, that when they got ashore they would use their liberty that none had power to command them, the patent procured being for Virginia, and not for New England, which belonged to another company, with which the Virginia Company had nothing to do. And, further, it was believed by the leading men among the settlers that such a deed, drawn up by themselves, considering their present condition, would be as effective as any patent, and in some respects more so. The form of the deed was as follows. In the name of God, Amen. We whose names are underwritten, the loyal subjects of our dread sovereign Lord King James, by the grace of God, of Great Britain, France, and Ireland, King, Defender of the Faith, etc., having undertaken for the glory of God and advancement of the Christian faith, and honor of our King and country, a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia, do by these presents solemnly and mutually in the presence of God
and of one another, covenant and combine ourselves into a civil body politic, for our better ordering and preservation, and the furtherance of the ends aforesaid, and by virtue hereof to enact, constitute, and frame such just and equal laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions, and offices, from time to time, as shall be thought most meet and convenient for the general use of the colony, unto which we promise all due submission and obedience. In witness whereof we have here underscribed our names as Cape Cod, 11th of November, in the year of the reign of our sovereign Lord, King James of England, France and Ireland in the 18th, and of Scotland the 54th, A.D. 1620. They then chose, or rather confirmed, Mr. John Carver, a godly man and highly approved among them, as their governor for that year. After they had provided a place for their goods and common stores, which they were long in unlading, owing to want of boats, the severity of the winter weather, the sickness, had begun some small cottages for dwellings. As time would admit, they met and consulted of law and order, both for civil and military government, as seemed suited to their conditions, adding to them from time to time as urgent need demanded. In these arduous and difficult beginnings, discontent and murmuring arose amongst some, and mutinous speech and bearing in others. But they were soon quelled and overcome by the wisdom, patience, and just and equal administration of things by the governor and the better part, who held faithfully together in the main. But soon a most lamentable blow fell upon them. In 2 or 3 months' time half of their company died, partly owing to the severity of the winter, especially during January and February, and the want of houses and other comforts, partly to scurvy and other diseases, which their long voyage and their incommodious quarters had brought upon them. Of all the 100-odd persons, scarcely 50 remained, and sometimes 2 or 3 persons died in a day. In the time of worst distress, there were but 6 or 7 sound persons, who, to their great commendation be it spoken, spared no pains night or day, but with great toil and at the risk of their own health, fetched wood, made fires, prepared food for the sick, made their beds, washed their infected clothes, dressed and undressed them. In a word, did all the homely and necessary services for them, which dainty and queasy stomachs cannot endure to hear mentioned. And all this they did willingly and cheerfully, without the least grudging, showing their love to the friends and brethren, a rare example and worthy to be remembered. 2 of these 7 were Mr. William Brewster, their reverend elder, and Miles Standish, their captain and military commander, to whom myself and many others were much beholden in our low and sick condition. And yet the Lord so upheld these men, that in this general calamity they were not at all infected with sickness. And what I have said of these few, I should say of many others who died in this general visitation, and others yet living, that while they had health or strength, they forsook none that had need of them. I doubt not that their recompense is with the Lord. But I must not pass by another remarkable and unforgettable occurrence. When this calamity fell among the passengers who were to be left here to settle, they were hurried ashore and made to drink water, so that the sailors might have the more beer. And when one sufferer in his sickness desired but a small can of beer, it was answered that if he were their own father he should have none. Then the disease began to seize the sailors also, so that almost half of the crew died before they went away, and many of their officers and strongest men, amongst them the boatswain, gunner, 3 quartermasters, the cook, and others. At this the captain was somewhat struck, and sent to the sick ashore, and told the governor that he could send for beer for those that had need of it, even should he have to drink water on the homeward voyage. But amongst the sailors there was quite a different bearing in their misery. Those who before, in the time of their health and welfare, had been boon companions in drinking and jollity, began now to desert one another, saying they would not risk their lives for the sick among them, lest they should be infected by coming to help them in their cabins. If they died, let them die. But the passengers who were still aboard showed them what pity they could, which made some of their hearts relent, such as the boatswain, who was an overbearing young man, and before would often curse and scoff at the passengers. But when he grew weak, they had compassion on him, and helped him. Then he confessed he did not deserve it at their hands, for he had abused them in word and deed. "Oh," said he, "you I see now, show your love like Christians indeed to one another, but we let one another lie and die like dogs. Another lay cursing his wife, saying if it had not been for her, he had never come on this unlucky voyage. And anon cursed his fellows, saying he had done this or that for some of them. He had spent so much and so much amongst them, and they were now weary of him, and did not help him in his need. Another made over to one of his mates all he had, when he should die, if he would but help him in his weakness. So his companion went and got a little spice, and prepared some food once or twice. And when he did not die as soon as he expected, he went among his comrades and swore the rogue would cheat him of his inheritance. He would see him choke before he prepared him any more food. And so the poor fellow died before morning. All this while the Indians came skulking about those who were ashore, and would sometimes show themselves aloof, at a distance. But when any approached them, they would run away. Once they stole away the men's tools where they had been at work, and were gone to dinner. About the 16th of March, a certain Indian came boldly among them, and spoke to them in broken English, which they could well understand, but were astonished at it. At length they understood by speaking with him that he was not of these parts, but belonged to the eastern country, where some English ships came to fish. And with some of these English he was acquainted, and could name several of them. From them he had got his knowledge of the language. He became useful to them in acquainting them with many things concerning the state of the country in the east parts where he lived, as also of the people there, their names and number, their situation and distance from this place, and who was chief among them. His name was Samoset. He told them also of another Indian, whose name was Squanto, a native of this part, who had been in England and could speak English better than himself. After some time of entertainment, being dismissed with gifts, in a little while he returned with 5 more, and they brought back all the tools that had been stolen, and made way for the coming of their great Sachem, called Massasoit, who about 4 or 5 days later came with the chief of his friends and other attendants, and with Squanto. With him, after friendly entertainment and some gifts, they made a peace, which has now continued for 24 years. These were the terms. 1. That neither he nor any of his should injure or harm any of their people. 2. That if any of his did any harm to any of theirs, he should send the offender, that they might punish him. 3. That if anything were taken away from any of theirs, he should cause it to be restored, and they should do the like to his. 4. If any made unjust war against him, they would aid him. If any made war against them, he should aid them. 5. He should send to his neighboring confederates to certify them of this, that they might not wrong them, but might be likewise comprised in the conditions of peace. 6. That when their men came to them, they should leave their bows and arrows behind them. After this he returned to his place, called Soams, some 40 miles off, but Squanto stayed with them, and was their interpreter, and became a special instrument sent of God for their good, beyond their expectation. He showed them how to plant their corn, where to take fish and other commodities, and guided them to unknown places, and never left them till he died. He was a native of these parts, and had been one of the few survivors of the plague hereabouts. He was carried away with others by one Hunt, a captain of a ship, who intended to sell them for slaves in Spain, but he got away for England, and was received by a merchant in London, and employed in Newfoundland and other parts, and lastly brought into these parts by a Captain Dermer, a gentleman employed by Sir Ferdinand Gorges, and others, for discovery and other projects in these parts. Of Captain Dermer I will say something, because it is mentioned, in a book published A.D. 1622 by the President and Council of New England, that he made peace between the savages of these parts and the English, of which this plantation, as it is there intimated, had the benefit. But what kind of peace it was appears by what befell him and his men. Captain Dermer had been here the same year that the people of the Mayflower arrived, as appears in an account written by him and given to me by a friend, bearing date June 30th, 1620. And as they came in the November following, there was but 4 months' difference. In this account to his honored friend, he makes the following references to this very place. I will first begin, says he, with the place from which Squanto, or Tisquantum, was taken away, which in Captain Smith's map is called Plymouth. And I would that Plymouth had the same commodities. I could wish that the first plantation might be situated here, if there came to the number of 50 persons or upward. otherwise at Charlton, because there the savages are less to be feared. The Pokanokets, who live to the west of Plymouth, bear an inveterate hatred to the English, and are of greater strength than all the savages from there to Penobscot. Their desire of revenge was occasioned by an Englishman, who having invited many of them on board, slaughtered them with small shot, when, as the Indians say, they offered no injury on their part. Whether they were English or no, it may be doubted, but they believe they were, for the French have so assured them. For this reason Squanto cannot deny but they would have killed me when I was at Namasket, had he not interceded hard for me. The soil of the borders of this great bay may be compared to most of the plantations which I have seen in Virginia. The land is of various sorts. Patuxet is a stubborn but strong soil. Nauset and Satucket are for the most part a blackish and deep mold, much like that where the best tobacco in Virginia grows. In the Great Bay itself is a quantity of cod and bass or mullet." End quote. But above all, he commends the Pokanokets country for the richest soil, and much open ground fit for English grain, etc. Massachusetts, about 9 leagues from Plymouth, and situated between both, is full of islands and peninsulas, for the most part very fertile. He was taken prisoner by the Indians at Manamoick, a place not far off, now well known. He gave them what they demanded for his liberty, but when they had got what they desired, they still kept him, and endeavored to kill his men. But he freed himself by seizing some of them, whom he kept bound till they gave him a canoe-load of corn. But this was A.D. 1619. After the writing of the foregoing narrative, Dermer went with Squanto to the island of Capawack, which lies south of this place on the way to Virginia. There he went ashore amongst the Indians to trade, as he used to do, but was betrayed and assaulted by them, and all his men were killed except one who kept the boat. He himself got aboard very sorely wounded, and they would have cut off his head as he climbed into his boat, had not the man rescued him. They got away and made shift to reach Virginia, where he died. This shows how far the natives were from peace, and under what dangerous conditions this plantation was begun, but for the powerful hand of the Lord which protected him. This was partly the reason why they kept aloof, and were so long before they came to the English. Another reason, as afterwards they themselves stated, was that about 3 years before a French ship was wrecked at Cape Cod, but the men got ashore and saved their lives, and a large part of their provisions. When the Indians heard of it, they surrounded them, and never left watching and dogging them till they got the advantage and killed them, all but 3 or 4, whom they kept, and sent from one sachem to another, making sport with them, and using them worse than slaves. Of these Captain Dermer released 2. So the Indians thought that this ship had now come to revenge these outrages. It was also later disclosed that before they came to the English to make friends, they got all the powwows of the country together for 3 days to curse and execrate them in a horrid and devilish manner with conjurations, holding their assembly in a dark and dismal swamp. But to return. The spring now approaching, it pleased God the mortality began to cease among them, and the sick recovered apace, which put new life into them all, though they had borne their sad afflictions with as much patience and contentedness as I think any people could do. But it was the Lord who upheld them, and had beforehand prepared them, many having long borne the yoke, yea, even from their youth. Many other minor matters I will omit, several of them having been published already in a journal written by one of the company, and some other narratives and descriptions of journeys already published, to which I refer those who wish to acquaint themselves more closely. Having now come to the 25th of March, I will begin the year 1621.
'Tis the gift to be simple. 'Tis the gift to be free. 'Tis the gift to come down where we ought to be. And when we find ourselves in the place just right, 'twill be in the valley of love and delight. When true simplicity is gained, to bow and to bend, we will not be ashamed. To turn will be our delight, till by turning, we come round right.
Life is complex. Join us for the simple gifts of wisdom, love, and delight in the written word. Of Plymouth Plantation by William Bradford. Book 2, 1620 to 1646. History of the New Settlement at Plymouth. Chapter 2. The Mayflower Returns. Death of John Carver. William Bradford, Governor. Trade with the Massachusetts. The First Marriage. Friendship with Massasoit confirmed. Hobbamuck. Expedition against Corbitant. The First Harvest. Arrival of Robert Cushman with 35 settlers. Fortune returns, Leyden. The Narragansett's Challenge. Christmas Day, 1621. They now decided to send back the ship which had brought them over, and which had remained till about this time or the beginning of April. The reason, on their part, why she had stayed so long, was the necessity and danger they were under. It was well towards the end of December before she could land anything, or they were in a condition to receive anything ashore. And after that, on the 14th of January, the house they had built for a general rendezvous accidentally caught fire, and some of them had to go aboard the ship for shelter. Then the sickness began to fall among them sorely, and the weather was so bad that they could not hasten their preparations. Again the governor and the chief members, seeing so many fall sick and die daily, thought it unwise to send the ship away, considering their condition and the danger they were in from the Indians, till they could procure some shelter, and therefore thought it better to incur further expense for themselves and their friends than to risk everything. And though before the captain and sailors had hurried the passengers ashore, so that they could be gone, now many of the crew being dead, and some of the ablest of them, and of the rest many lay sick and weak, the captain did not dare put to sea till he saw them begin to recover, and the heart of winter over. The settlers, as many as were able, then began to plant their corn, in which service Squanto stood them in good stead, showing them how to plant it and cultivate it. He also told them that unless they got fish to manure this exhausted old soil, it would come to nothing, and he showed them that in the middle of April plenty of fish would come up the brook, by which they had begun to build, and taught them how to catch it, and where to get other necessary provisions, all of which they found true by experience. They sowed some English seed, such as wheat and peas, but it came to no good, either because of the badness of the seed, or the lateness of the season, or some other defect. This April, while they were busy sowing their seed, their governor, Mr. John Carver, one hot day came out of the field very sick. He complained greatly of his head, and lay down, and within a few hours his senses failed. He never spoke again, and died a few days later. His death was much lamented, and depressed them deeply, with good cause. He was buried in the best manner possible, with some volleys of shot by all that bore arms, and his wife, a weak woman, died 5 or 6 weeks after him. Shortly after, William Bradford was chosen governor in his stead, and having not yet recovered from his illness, in which he had been near the point of death, Isaac Allerton was appointed assistant to him. These two, by renewed election each year, continued several years together. This I here note, once for all. On May 12th, the first marriage here took place, which according to the laudable custom of the Low Countries, in which they had lived, it was thought proper for the magistrate to perform, as a civil institution upon which many questions about inheritances depend, and other things requiring their cognizance, as well as being consonant with the Scriptures, Ruth 4, and nowhere mentioned in the Gospels as a part of the minister's duty. Having now made some progress with their affairs at home, it was thought advisable to send a deputation to their new friend Massasoit, and to bestow upon him some gratuity to bind him faster to them. Also at the same time to view the country, and see in what manner he lived, what strength he had about him, and what was the way to his place, if at any time they should have need. So on July 2nd they sent Mr. Edward Winslow and Mr. Hopkins, with the aforesaid Squanto for their guide. They gave Massasoit a suit of clothes, and a horseman's coat, with some other small things, which were kindly accepted, though they found but short commons, and came home both weary and hungry. The Indians in those times did not have nearly so much corn as they have had since the English supplied them with hoes, and set them an example by their industry in preparing new ground therewith. Massasoit's place was found to be 40 miles off, and the soil good. But his people had died in great numbers during the recent plague throughout these parts, about 3 years before the coming of the English. Thousands of them died, until the living were not able to bury the dead, and their skulls and bones were found in many places lying still above ground, where their houses and dwelling places had been, a very sad spectacle. But they brought word that the Narragansetts lived just on the other side of the great bay, and were a strong, populous tribe living close together, and had not been attacked by this wasting plague. About the latter end of this month one John Billington lost himself in the woods, and wandered up and down for about 5 days, living on berries and what he could find. At length he came across an Indian plantation, 20 miles to the south, called Manamet. They conveyed him further off to Nauset, among the Indians who had set upon the landing party when they were coasting and whilst their ship lay at the Cape, as before noted. But the governor caused him to be inquired for among the Indians, and at length Massasoit sent word where he was, and the governor sent a shallop for him, and had him delivered. The Indians there also came and made their peace, and full satisfaction was given by the settlers to those whose corn they had found and taken when they were at Cape Cod. Thus their peace and acquaintance was pretty well established with the natives about them. Another Indian, called Habamock, came to live with them, a fine strong man, of some account amongst the Indians for his valor and qualities. He remained very faithful to the English till he died. He and Squanto having gone upon business among the Indians, a Sachem called Corbitant, allied to Massasoit, but never a good friend to the English to this day, met with them at an Indian town called Namasaket, 14 miles west of this, and whether out of envy of them or malice to the English, began to quarrel with them, and threatened to stab Habamock. But he, being a strong man, cleared himself of him and came running away, all sweating, and told the governor what had befallen him, and that he feared they had killed Squanto, for they threatened them both, for no other reason than that they were friends to the English and serviceable to them. The governor taking counsel, it was decided not to pass it over, for if they allowed their friends and messengers to be harmed, none would associate with them, or give them intelligence, or do them service afterwards. And next thing the Indians would fall upon them too. So it was resolved to send the captain and 14 men, well armed, and to go and fall upon them in the night, and if they found that Squanto was killed, to cut off Corbitant's head, but not to hurt any but those who had a hand in it. Habamock was asked if he would go and be their guide, and bring them there before day. He said he would, and could show them the house where Corbitant lived, and which he was. They set forth on the 14th of August, and surrounded the house, and the captain, giving orders to let none escape, entered to search for him. But he had gone away that day, so they missed him, but learned that Squanto was alive, and that Corbitant had only threatened to kill him, and made as if to stab him, but did not. So they withheld their punishment, and did no more harm. And the people came trembling, and brought them the best provisions they had, when they had been acquainted by Habamock with their purpose. 3 Indians, badly wounded, broke out of the house, and tried to pass through the guard. These they brought back with them, and had their wounds dressed and cured, and then sent them home. After this they had many meetings from various Sachems, and much firmer peace. Even the Indians of the island of Capawack sent to declare friendship, and Corbitant himself used the mediation of Massasoit to make his peace, but was shy to come near them for a long time after. After this, on the 18th September, they sent out their shallop with 10 men and Squanto as guide and interpreter to the Massachusetts, to explore the bay and trade with the natives, which they accomplished, and were kindly received. The Indians were much afraid of the Tarantines, a tribe to the eastward, who used to come at harvest time and take away their corn, and often kill some of them. They returned in safety and brought home a good quantity of beaver, and reported on the place, wishing they could have settled there. But it seems that the Lord, who assigns to all men the bounds of their habitations, had appointed it for another use. And thus they found the Lord to be with them in all their ways, and to bless their outgoings and incomings, for which let his holy name have the praise forever, to all posterity. They began now to gather in the small harvest they had, and to prepare their houses for the winter, being well recovered in health and strength, and plentifully provisioned. For while some had been thus employed in affairs away from home, others were occupied in fishing for cod, bass, and other fish, of which they caught a good quantity, every family having their portion. All the summer there was no want. And now, as winter approached, wildfowl began to arrive, of which there were plenty when they came here first, though afterwards they became more scarce. As well as wildfowl they had got abundance of wild turkeys, besides venison, etc. Each person had about a peck of meal a week, or now, since harvest, Indian corn in that proportion. And afterwards many wrote at length about their plenty to their friends in England, not feigned, but true reports. In November, about 12 months after their arrival, there came a small ship unexpectedly, bringing Mr. Cushman, so much spoken of before, and with him 35 persons to remain and live in the plantation, at which they rejoiced not a little. And the new arrivals, when they came ashore and found all well, and saw plenty of victuals in every house, were no less glad. Most of them were healthy young men, many of them wild enough, who had little considered what they were undertaking, till they reached the harbour of Cape Cod, and there saw nothing but a naked and barren place. They then began to wonder what would become of them, should the people be dead or cut off by the Indians. So, hearing what some of the sailors were saying, they began to plot to seize the sails, lest the ship should go and leave them there. But the captain, hearing of it, gave them good words, and told them that if any misfortune should have befallen the people here, he thought he had food enough to take them to Virginia, and whilst he had a bit, they should have their share, which satisfied them. So they were all landed, but they brought not so much as biscuit cake, or any other victuals with them, nor any bedding, except some poor things they had in their cabins, nor pot nor pan to cook any food in, nor many clothes, for many of them had sold their coats and cloaks at Plymouth on their way out. But some birching lane suits were sent over in the ship, out of which they were supplied. The plantation was glad of this addition of strength, but could have wished that many of them had been of better class, and all of them better furnished with provisions, but that could not now be helped. In this ship Mr. Weston sent a long letter to Mr. Carver, the late governor, now deceased, full of complaints and expostulations about the former troubles at Southampton, and keeping the ship so long in the country, and returning her without lading, etc., most of which for brevity I omit. The rest is as follows. Mr. Weston in England to Mr. John Carver at New Plymouth. I never dared acquaint the adventurers with the alterations in the conditions first agreed on between us, which I have since been very glad of, for I am well assured that had they known as much as I do, they would not have ventured a halfpenny of what was necessary for this ship. That you sent no lading back with the ship is strange, and very properly resented. I know your weakness was the cause of it, and I believe more weakness of judgment than weakness of hands. A quarter of the time you spent in discoursing, arguing, and consulting would have done much more, but that is past. If you mean, bona fide, to perform the conditions agreed upon, do us the favour to copy them out fair, and subscribe them with the names of your principal members, and likewise give us account, as particularly as you can, how our money was laid out. Then I shall be able to give them some satisfaction, while I am now forced to put them off with good words. And consider that the life of this business depends on the lading of this ship. If you do so satisfactorily, so that I may recoup the great sums I disbursed for the former voyage, and must do for this one, I promise you I will never forsake this enterprise, though all the other adventurers should do so. We have procured you a charter, the best we could, which is better than the former, and with less limitations. As for anything else that is worth writing, Mr. Cushman can inform you. I pray write instantly for Mr. Robinson to come to you, and so, praying God to bless you with all graces necessary both for this life and that to come, I rest. Your loving friend, Thomas Weston. London, July 6, 1621. This ship, called the Fortune, was speedily dispatched, laden with good clabard, as full as she could stow, and 2 hogsheads of beaver and otter skins, which they had traded in exchange for a few trifling commodities brought with them at first, being otherwise altogether unprovided for trading. Nor was there a man among them who had ever seen a beaver skin till they came out, and were instructed by squanto. The freight was estimated to be worth nearly £500. Mr. Cushman returned with the ship, as Mr. Weston and the rest had commissioned him, for their better information, and neither he nor the settlers doubted that they would receive speedy supplies, considering that, owing to Mr. Cushman's persuasion, and to letters which they received from the congregation at Leyden, urging them to do so, they agreed to the aforesaid conditions, and signed them. But it proved otherwise, for Mr. Weston, who had made that large promise in his letter, that if all the rest should drop out, he would never quit the business, but would stick to them if they signed the conditions and sent some lading on the ship, and of this Mr. Cushman was equally confident, confirming it by Mr. Weston's own words, and serious protestations to himself before he left. All this, I say, proved but wind, for he was the first and only man that forsook them, and that before he had so much as heard of the return of the ship, or knew what had been done. So vain is confidence in man. But of this, more in its place. A letter in answer to that written by Mr. Weston to Mr. Carver was sent from the governor, of which so much as is pertinent to the thing in hand I will insert here. Governor Bradford, at New Plymouth, to Mr. Weston, in England. Sir, Your long letter, written to Mr. Carver and dated July 6, 1621, I received on November 10th, wherein, after the apology made for yourself, you lay many imputations upon him and us all. Touching him, he is now departed this life, and is at rest in the Lord from all these troubles and encumbrances with which we yet strive. He needs not my apology, for his care and pains were so great for the common good, both ours and yours, that, as it is thought, he thereby oppressed himself and shortened his days, of whose loss we cannot sufficiently complain. At great expense in this adventure I confess you have been, and many losses may sustain. But the loss of his and many other industrious men's lives cannot be valued at any price. Of the one there may be hope of recovery, but the other no recompense can make good. However, I will not confine myself to general statements, but will deal with your particular charges. You greatly blame us for keeping the ship so long in the country, and then sending her away empty. She lay 5 weeks at Cape Cod, whilst with many a weary step, after a long journey and the endurance of many a hard brunt, we sought out in the depth of winter a place of habitation. Then we set about, as well as we could, to provide shelter for ourselves and our goods, upon which task many of our arms and legs can tell us to this day that we were not negligent. But it pleased God to visit us then with death daily, and with a disease so disastrous that the living were scarcely able to bury the dead, and the healthy not in any measure to tend the sick. And now to be so greatly blamed for not freighting the ship touches us near, and discourages us much. But you say you know we shall plead weakness. And do you think we had not cause? Yes, you tell us you believe it, but that it was more weakness of judgment than of hands. Our weakness herein is great, we confess. Therefore we will bear this rebuke patiently, with the rest, till God send us wiser men. But those who told you we spent so much time in discoursing and consulting, etc., their hearts can tell, their tongues they lie. They care not, so that they salve their own sores, how they wound others. Indeed, it is our calamity that we are, beyond expectation, yoked with some ill-disposed people who, while they do no good themselves, corrupt and abuse others. The rest of the letter stated that they had subscribed to the conditions according to his desire, and sent him the previous accounts very exactly. Also how the ship was laden, and in what condition their affairs stood. That the arrival of the new people would bring famine upon them unavoidably, if they did not receive supplies in time, as Mr. Cushman could more fully inform him and the rest of the adventurers. Also that, seeing he was not satisfied in all his demands, he hoped offences would be forgotten, and he would remember his promise, etc. After the departure of this ship, which did not stay above 14 days, the governor and his assistant, having disposed the new arrivals among several families as best they could, took an exact account of all their provisions in store, and proportioned the same to the number of persons, and found that it would not hold out above 6 months at half allowance, and hardly that. They could not well give less this winter, till fish came in again. So they were presently put on half allowance, one as well as another. It became irksome, but they bore it patiently, hoping to receive fresh supplies. Soon after this ship's departure, the great Narragansett tribe, in a braving manner, sent a messenger to them with a bundle of arrows tied about with a great snakeskin, which their interpreters told them was a threatening challenge. Upon which the governor, with the advice of the others, sent them a round answer, that if they would rather have war than peace, they might begin when they would. They had done them no wrong, neither did they fear them, nor would they find them unprepared. They sent the snakeskin back by another messenger's with bullets in it, but they would not receive it, and returned it again. These things I need merely mention, because they are fully dealt with in print by Mr. Winslow at the request of some friends. The reason was probably their own ambition, thinking, since the death of so many of the Indians, to domineer and lord it over the rest, and that the English would be a bar in their way, Massasoit having taken shelter already under their wings. But this made the settlers more careful to look to themselves. They agreed to enclose their dwellings in a good strong stockade, and make flankers in convenient places, with gates to shut. These they locked every night, and a watch was kept, and when need required there were also outposts in the daytime. The colonists, at the captain's and governor's advice, were divided into 4 squadrons, and every one had his quarter appointed, to which to repair at any sudden alarm. And in case of fire, a company with muskets was appointed as a guard, to prevent Indian treachery, whilst the others quenched it. This was accomplished very cheerfully, and the town was enclosed by the beginning of March, every family having a pretty garden plot. Herewith I shall end this year, except to recall one more incident, rather amusing than serious. On Christmas Day the governor called the people out to work as usual, but most of the new company excused themselves, and said it went against their consciences to work on that day. So the governor told them, if they made it a matter of conscience, he would spare them till they were better informed. So he went with the rest, and left them. But on returning from work at noon he found them at play in the street, some pitching the bar, some at stool ball, and such like sports. So he went to them, and took away their games, and told them that it was against his conscience that they should play and others work. If they made the keeping of the day a matter of devotion, let them remain in their houses. But there should be no gaming, and revelling in the streets. Since then, nothing has been attempted in that way, at least openly.
'Tis the gift to be simple. 'Tis the gift to be free. 'Tis the gift to come down where we ought to be. And when we find ourselves in the place just right, 'twill be in the valley of love and delight. When true simplicity is gained, to bow and to bend, we will not be ashamed. To turn will be our delight, till by turning, we come round right.